the Mentor Roulette. The closest you get to a total anything goes roulette in Final Fantasy XIV. However, given that this anything goes ranges from something as simple and easy as the guild test under the armor, which is nearly impossible to fail and takes like 30 seconds, all the way up to Abyssal Fracture Extreme, assuming someone queues for it, which very likely will be 60 minutes of trying. There's good reason to consider what you're queuing as before you start. So, welcome to my tier list of all the eligible jobs. I'm Kaizochaiji, and I've gone through a set of Mentor Roulettes as every one of these jobs over the course of Dawntrail, and also made job guides for each of them. I would say I have a reasonably high skill level with all of the jobs, but of course I have some I'm worse at than others, but that should not impact my ranking of the jobs. The way I will rank these jobs is such that the more capable a job is at carrying a group, or alternatively, the more impactful its presence is in a group, the higher it will rank in the tier list. In contrast, the lower a job ranks in the tier list, the more likely it relies on the rest of the group to perform for it to do well. Which, in a weird twist, makes these jobs better at landing in situations where a mentor would have to at least attempt to teach their team something when things go sideways. Obviously, if you land in an extreme, this is likely to happen even with the most qualified of jobs, but it is a matter of consistency. Imagine a random team for a random duty and assume all of the players are terrible, and you have the choice for one of them to be replaced with a really good player with the same job. Who would you pick? Probably one of the S tier jobs in this list. Another factor that sometimes might play in is that different roles, probably unsurprisingly, get a somewhat different selection of duties in their Mentor Roulettes, although this can also depend on the time of day, time of the week, and whether there's a special event going on. However, in my experience, healers have a much higher probability of landing in A Realm Reborn casual content, with a notable emphasis on leveling and level 50 dungeon duties. DPS, on the other hand, have a much higher probability of landing in guild tests and extremes, as well as alliance raids, and at times, like normal raids. Tanks appear to have the greatest variety in my experience, but they also have a much higher probability of getting leveling and high-level dungeon duties just like healers. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start the list. I'll go through the jobs in the same order I did them in Mentor Roulette, meaning that we start with Black Mage, which face plants straight into F tier. Not only does Black Mage not provide any significant utility to the team, the job performs extremely poorly in lower level content as well. Guild tests, Crystal Tower, and A Realm Reborn extremes are all very bad matchups for Black Mage, and it does not make up for it very well at higher levels, even if it is very strong at high levels. Next up, we have Viper, which goes in E tier. It provides just about the same utility as Black Mage, which is to say basically none, but does not have the weakness of being terrible at low levels. In fact, Viper is sort of crazy at low levels, however, this isn't a unique trait. Viper is, however, very basic in its functionality in lower levels, although that does not impact its ranking. The job is very consistent in its performance in most levels. Next is Pictomancer, which I will place in C tier. While the job provides very little utility and only really unlocks Tempera Grasa in the rarer high-level duties, Pictomancer is so ludicrously strong on pure damage output that a solid Pictomancer can sometimes be the only reason certain mechanics are skipped in older extremes, which is an indirect kind of utility, I suppose. The fact Hammer Stamp is available at level 50 especially helps to push Pictomancer to the C tier. Even in super low level content where all Pictomancer has is fire and red, it still surpasses a Black Mage in damage output and mobility. Dark Knight is next, and it probably isn't too surprising that, as a tank, Dark Knight goes in the A tier. At its peak, Dark Knight is still significantly less self-sufficient than all the other three tanks, and while its burst damage is impressive, for it to pull ahead of the other tanks, it relies on raid buffs, which we have to assume are not being done reliably in Mentor Roulettes. However, despite these flaws, Dark Knight is a tank, and tanks have a much stronger capacity to halt a run in situations where you attempt to give advice, which can also be a helpful trait sometimes. Next, we have our first S tier, Astrologian. The job is an absolute monster in low-level content, and unless you specifically need barriers, is probably the most consistently capable of the 4 healers in Mentor Roulette. The defensive cards push Astrologian in dungeon content to feel like it always has several more cooldowns than the other healers. And Lightspeed being so readily available also makes Astrologian the most capable of the healers to multi-raise in a tough spot, which can be invaluable in extremes, should it come to that. The main weakness of Astrologian is that its damage output at higher levels relies heavily on divination and the damage cards, which means it is more heavily impacted by a bad team. Next up, we have Machinist, which goes in C tier. Yes, Machinist is ludicrously good at what it does, and it provides damage reduction buffs. However, comparable to Pictomancer, if damage isn't the answer to the problem, Machinist likely can't solve it. As a ranged physical, it does provide an interrupt, which is nice if the tank doesn't know about it. Machinist is, however, a solid DPS pick for the vast majority of content on offer. After that, we have Dragoon, which lands in F tier with Black Mage. Dragoon's low-level experience is horrendous, with being supremely late at picking up an AoE attack. Its damage output on single target isn't wildly impressive either in that level range, and it doesn't provide any utility. In short, for low-level stuff, a Viper would always beat a Dragoon, and at higher levels, Dragoon's damage performance relies in some part on Battle Litany, which isn't the best for Mentor Roulette. Now we have Warrior, another S tier. From level 56 and beyond, Warrior is the de facto solo king, capable of doing large AoE pulls entirely alone, as long as kiting is used to help. That alone isn't a requirement for Mentor Roulette, but does put into perspective how good Warrior is at carrying a group forward. While Warrior lacks this trait at lower levels, bringing potions can almost give a similar result. This is also the case for any other tank, of course. The biggest weakness of Warrior is that it is so good at doing casual content that it is very easy to paint over a bad group's mistakes, and this can enable some bad habits of healers, especially at higher levels. Tier 1 anyone? The problem being that often you would have to outright play badly on purpose to highlight the issues. Next is Ninja, landing firmly in D tier. It has a defensive cooldown, but similar to Dragoon, takes a while to get going on its damage in terms of levels. Doton can also both be viewed as an upside and a downside. The upside is that it is a great learning opportunity for the tank, that it is safe and okay, and it puts you in a strong position to teach other ninjas to not use Doton on single target. The downside is that you rely on your tank to actually play around your Doton for good AoE damage. And now we have another A tier with Sage. At super low levels, Sage has some issues, lacking anything to cast while on the move when Eucrasia is not available. And in the level range before Adderskull, the fact you have to alternate between healing and attacking at times when the tank pulls really big is a bit of a weakness of the job. Past level 46, however, where both Adderskull and Discrasia are available, Sage is much more worthy of an S tier rating, and tends to duke it out on even footing with Skull on who's the best, depending on what an encounter calls for. Next, we have Monk, which also goes in D tier. While the job gets AoE a bit sooner than some of the other melees, Monk has an awkward phase until it gets Masterful Blitz at level 60. And while it gets a defensive cooldown, that one is placed at level 64, meaning it is very likely that for a large part of the duties you will see in Mentor Roulette as Monk, you will be dealing with this awkward up to level 50 phase of the job, although the damage output at that level is also pretty fine. After that, we have Dancer, which also goes in D tier. At low levels, Dancer's damage rivals Machinist, but Dancer slowly moves over to rely more on the performance of their raid and their dance partner. A common issue with Dancer is also that having multiple of them can get very awkward very fast. Even if two dancers partnering each other does lead to a stacking standard finish, Devilment and Technical Finish still will not stack. Dancer's utility of Curing Waltz is pretty solid in the right situations, and it also comes with an interrupt of course, but the issues in regards to party composition drags it down from a C. Up next, we have Paladin, which I will put in B tier. Paladin has an exceptionally large part of its leveling where it doesn't have any built-in self-healing, and an even larger part where, while it does have some, it is pretty much just clemency. While at low levels this can be compensated for with potions, this still places Paladin in a very poor position for a lot of content. If I were to only rate the job from level 82 and onwards where it has Holy Sheltron, I would probably have put it in S tier. But the awkward party reliance section of its experience is too long, and queuing blindly for Mentor Roulette, I would probably always choose another tank over Paladin. Next we have Samurai, which also goes in D tier. Similar to Ninja, Samurai has a defensive cooldown, although Samurai's defensive is available a lot more frequently, and at higher levels is a lot more effective too. Samurai's AoE also comes online a bit sooner, not to mention that it has better personal damage. However, I feel this more places Samurai in like a D+ place rather than C, as it still doesn't really provide much utility for the raid. After that, we have Red Mage, which I will place in B tier, which might be a bit surprising. While Red Mage has amazing, almost bordering on overpowered utility with Veraze, and to some degree Valkyr, Valkyr isn't available in a Realm Reborn extremes, and Veraze isn't even available in Heavensward extremes, which means the large majority of truly hard content you will likely face in Mentor Roulette, Red Mage lacks its most defining utility options. That is to say, if Stormblood and above extremes were a lot more common in Mentor Roulette, then Red Mage would probably be at least an A tier, if not S tier. The simple fact that Red Mage does not get Veraze until level 64 has been the deciding factor for me before when choosing what job to play in Roulette content. And now we have White Mage, which I will also put in B tier. There are two glaring issues that lead me to this decision. The first one is that White Mage is pretty much worse at everything than all the other healers until like level 60, if not later, with very few niche exceptions like having Cure 3. This means that there is more Mentor Roulette content where White Mage is weaker than the other healers than there is content where it stands on equal footing with them. A particularly glaring point here is that Astrologian gets Aspected Helios 10 levels before White Mage gets Medica 2. Not to mention that while White Mage works with Regen and Cure 2, Astrologian has its card system online, and Essential Dignity, and Aspected Benefic, and Benefic 2. The other glaring issue with White Mage is Holy. Among all the healers, only White Mage has an attack rotation that the tank needs to think about. And then we have Bard, which, weirdly, also goes in the B tier. I had initially planned to put Bard in C tier with Machinist, however, while Bard has a severe raid buff reliance issue, and its level 50 rotation is awkward without Wanderer's Minuet, Bard being the only non-healer with debuff removal puts it in an extremely strong position in a group where you could imagine, sometimes, the healer either doesn't know how to use a Shuna or doesn't care to. It isn't even a case of Warden's Paean being an OGCD, it is simply that it is there, which can be immensely helpful or outright irreplaceable in some content. Next comes another S tier with Gunbreaker. In the specific level range where Warrior stands a little less solidly, Gunbreaker stands as the strongest among the tanks, defensively. And this means that Gunbreaker is extremely reliable in all level ranges, in comparison to both Warrior and Paladin that have weird low-level stages and amazing high-level stages. If I were to queue for a random roulette and there was an actually equal chance that I got content of any level range, Gunbreaker would be my tank of choice, not Warrior. After that comes Reaper, which also goes in the C tier. Among all the melee DPS, Reaper has a good damage performance in all level ranges, even if at low levels it is very boring. It gets its AoE reasonably early, and it has a reliable defensive cooldown that later is upgraded to give the raid healing. While it might not excel nearly as much in any specific level range or field compared to the other melees, Reaper is the most reliable of the 6, while also providing some utility. And for the last DPS, Summoner goes in A tier. As the only DPS that always has raise in any content where it might be needed, it is by far the safest pick as a DPS job in Mentor Roulette. Summoner does come with its own weaknesses though. It has a very flat DPS performance for majority of its levels, and while it has Physic, it is basically worthless by level 50 or so. The job also relies on a rather specific amount of spell speed by level 60, and aside from the insanely helpful raise, it doesn't bring that much to the table. You can make Physic quote-unquote effective at, say, level 50 by making use of the PvP Field Commander set to increase Mind alongside Intelligence, not to mention Strength for those sweet book smacks. But this is mostly in the realm of wacky builds more than being optimal. And finally, Scholar, which also goes in S tier of course. Scholar does not have the weird low-level weakness that Sage has, and the higher level you get, the more flexible Scholar can get in its performance, to adjust to what is needed. The pet being available and helping with healing from the very start, even in the level range where Scholar might need to rely on healing spells itself to heal, also puts it a step ahead of Sage. I know I've gone a little fast through each job, but with 21 jobs, this video would be way too long if I said every little thing I had about a job's ranking. With that said, let me just reiterate that the way the ranking works is that since ranking higher on the list means the job is more capable of carrying the group, often through utility more so than raw power, it means the higher ranking jobs are more likely to be able to clear a duty despite players in the party being found lacking. A warrior or a gunbreaker could probably clear most A Realm Reborn dungeons if they bring potions, even with a healer asleep at the wheel. Similarly, even a white mage, if they are a good player, could probably do most casual content with a lazy tank, or not even a tank at all. This is on the one hand really good, on the other hand, how do you convince a Sprout healer to use Cure 2 instead of Cure 1 if, clearly, you hardly need either? How do you convince a Sprout tank to use defensives when you just survived a pull just fine without them? Obviously, many players will listen to the advice to be better just the same, but it leads to a challenge in teaching when the teachings themselves might feel redundant at the outset. On the other end, jobs like Black Mage, who don't really provide anything utility-wise to the group, are more likely to land in a situation where, perhaps, both the tank and the healer are not solid, so it is more likely to land in a situation that calls for advice. This does mean that the less willing you are to talk and teach in a Mentor Roulette, the worse of a match a DPS job is, because it leaves more of a burden on the random players you get paired with, which sometimes is good, sometimes is bad. By choosing a job that can bear more of the burden, you reduce the likelihood you have to rely on random players in your group being good. That doesn't mean bringing an S-tier job to an extreme will guarantee success though, but I do believe bringing a tank or a healer to a Heavensward extreme is much more likely to impact your ability to succeed than bringing Viper. But what do you think? Do you agree with my list? Do you feel I got some things wrong? Would you rank it differently? Or do you feel I overlooked something important when ranking a given job? Let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, back when cross-class actions were a thing, before Stormblood, Paladins could pick the Conjurer Raise spell. However, back then, using Raise in combat required a special trait that only actual Conjurers and White Mages would obtain, meaning that even if Paladins could pick Raise, they could not use it in a fight.